All right, let's go ahead and get started. Glad to see some of you have noticed the chat option. We have a chat section that goes to the panelists, but also just a general Q&A. I'll mention that in just a moment, but hello to those who have commented in the chat. So thanks everyone for being here. If at any time you can't hear me, please do let me know by messaging into the chat. But thank you all for being here with us for our first workshop on stress and ALS for patients. We are thrilled to provide this free service from Beyond My Battle in partnership with the ALS Association Upstate New York chapter. All of these workshops are generously sponsored by Mitsubishi Tanabe Pharma America, and we are grateful for their support. But given that this is the first workshop in a three-part series, I'd like to remind anyone attending live to be sure to register for the following two workshops if you haven't already on beyondmybattle.org. And those who are watching a recording of this, be sure to watch the following ones in the series if you can. So this is the second portion of our Stress and ALS series, where our initial workshop we presented was for ALS caregivers. If you're looking to find that presentation, you can do so through the ALS Association Upstate New York chapter. For those who are attending live, I encourage you to enter comments or questions into the Q&A, which should be a little, two little speech bubbles at the menu at the bottom of your screen, or I think it's the bottom of your screen. It's the top of mine, but can never be sure. Q&A box there. At any time during this workshop, you can enter questions or comments in there. If you're having trouble using this feature due to physical limitations or compatibility issues with your communication device, please feel free to invite a caregiver or a loved one to participate in this workshop with you and assist you in asking questions and or making any comments. If a question arises after you are watching the record or you're watching this as a recording, you can always reach out to us through the Beyond My Battle website. So yeah, and just a note about, anonymity, confidentiality, all the questions and comments that come to us that we will discuss at the end. I will not be naming any names. There is no identity shared. So let's get started. Okay. So first off, I just want to introduce myself. My name is Martel Catalano, and I'm the co-founder and director of Beyond My Battle. We're a nonprofit based in upstate New York that provides emotional support and educational resources to patients and caregivers managing all kinds of illnesses and disabilities. We support this community in managing the inherent stress that comes with having or caring for someone with an illness or disability. We do this through support groups, interactive resources, and workshops like these, all of which really focus on a mindfulness and compassion-based approach. I myself have a rare degenerative disease, and while much different than ALS, it's become clear through our work and my work at Beyond My Battle that no matter the diagnosis, there is a lot of commonality between people coping with things that are out of our control, like a rare disease or a disability. And the shared interest in remembering to come back to the things that we can, which is mostly our mindset and how we respond to our circumstances, is something that we see also shared throughout the overall community. So that being said, in today's workshop, we're going to start off by talking about stress. We can't start managing or reducing stress or really anything for that matter if we don't first understand what it is. And we'll then move on to introducing the idea of why stress is especially important for people with illnesses and disabilities to get a better understanding of, and then moving on to this idea of reframing stress, and lastly, on how stress can make it difficult or create a barrier for our loved ones or caregivers to understand our pain. And then I guess I should say, lastly, we'll talk a little bit about the role of grief. Next week, we'll look at understanding our individual stressors, how stress presents itself in our bodies and in our minds, and which is really the next step in managing it, right? And in week 3, we will work on strategies for mindful stress reduction. All right, so what is stress? So, like I said, we can't exactly manage and therefore reduce something that we don't understand. I see people all the time and talk to people all the time talking about what they do to get a hold of their stress, but simultaneously not really taking the time to examine how stress operates or presents itself in their individual lived experiences. So, when that happens, what I find occurs is that our solutions become like band-aids that like peel off and essentially leave the wound to reopen later on because the full work hasn't been done. That full examination hasn't been done. But really, we just want to go over the basics of stress. So stress is the body's reaction to any change that requires an adjustment or a response. So we respond to even small stressors by releasing stress hormones that like adrenaline or cortisol, which I'm sure you have heard of, meaning that stress is normal and it's an essential part of life. We need it. We've needed stress in life-threatening situations before, or just socially threatening situations before. We needed stress at times in our lives to meet various deadlines. We needed to regulate a sickness. So when we talk about stress in the general sense, it's not all that bad. And I think that's important to know because we throw this word around a lot. So it's part of surviving, and every living thing has stress. Even plants, use stress to get by or to make our favorite foods, or wines. In our conversations, though, about being a patient, we're going to be talking about chronic stress. And this is the stress that people managing an illness or a disability often fall into. And it's also the stress that caregivers often face, but a bit more on that in a bit. So why it's important to understand chronic stress is because, simply put, it's bad for our health. I know it's a punch in the gut to those of us who are already managing health challenges. I know that feeling, but that's why it's so important to understand and to get a handle on. So I just mentioned stress hormones, and I just kind of want to build on that for one quick second before moving on. Basically, in a passing stress, what I mean by this is in a passing stressful circumstance, we release these hormones and then the levels of them return back to normal. But when we're constantly facing stress, which patients often are by juggling the physical demands of their illness with appointments and medication and treatment and relationships changing and so on, our nervous system doesn't really get that chance to come back into balance the way that it possibly did before we had our diagnosis. So those hormones I mentioned, when they stay in that state, they alter our immune system, our digestive system, cardiovascular system. They alter blood pressure and heart rate and energy. And in so many words, being chronically stressed makes us more sick. Which makes us more stressed. So if it sounds like a vicious cycle, that's because it is, and we're going to talk about that. So we have the obvious vicious cycle that I just mentioned, where repeated stress that can't relax takes a negative toll on our body, which is stressful to manage. So we get more stressed, about it, which increases the negative toll on our body, and so on and so forth. But there is really another cycle I want to talk about today, and it's a less obvious cycle. It's the cycle that's displayed here in this visual, and because it's one that includes the way that we feel about things emotionally too. So the wear and tear of chronic stress leads to an unavoidable state, which is often referred to as uh, high tension, low energy, or just really a state where our energy is low and our tensions are high. But we're low on energy and tensions are high here, and when we're there, we tend to form what's called a negative bias. So a negative bias means that anything or sometimes everything has a greater chance of being perceived as negative, even when it isn't. So I don't think I'm making an assumption when I say that we've all been in this place before, um, where you just can't really see the goodness in anything or even everything. And if everything's really, really irritable, you don't even know why. Oftentimes, it's just like the headspace we are in. You get somebody offers you a great idea, great advice, your favorite food, you don't want it. Um, but this negative bias, it fuels more stress, creating this cycle that I'm talking about here. So stress leads to more stress, and there's no denying it, no matter which way you cut it. So in order to break this stress cycle, we can start to practice stress relieving solutions. However, for those to be successful and sustainable for time to come, I really believe that we need to become aware of how stress presents itself and how we each respond to it. Otherwise, again, like I said, those solutions just kind of act like band-aids. Um, so this is a framework that we use often at Beyond My Battle. It comes from this doctor mentioned here, Dr. Stuart Shanker. It's part of this SelfReg framework that is not only helped me and so many others that I know so much, but as a rare disease patient myself, but it's used in schools often to help children and in homes to help parents manage stress. So it's really accessible, which is why I love it so much. Um, but looking through these bullet points here, we have what are called in this framework the 5 domains of stress. They're basically like boxes, categories, types of stress. And I just want to preface this, I don't have this here, but sometimes a stressor can fit into more than one category. I know this looks like we love to fit things into boxes as human beings. We like to keep organized. But I do want to preface this by saying that sometimes one thing that's stressing you out can actually fit into a couple, and then they tend to spill over into each other. But I'll talk about that more in just a second. But looking through these, we have biological stressors that impact the physical body. It could be something as simple as just being too hot or too cold. That's the body, again, is trying to come back to a place of equilibrium, a place of homeostasis to get back out of that feeling. Or if we're tired, we're trying to, rest to get more energy. So those are our biological stressors. Of course, in there, pain, symptoms from our disease, flare ups, all of the things that cause us physical discomfort or distress. We have emotional stressors like fear or worry. Um, uh, Anything relationship wise is really considered a social stressor. So that would be like common ones are shame and embarrassment, having to see people you haven't seen in a while, anything, could be at work or your love life, anything that typically is in the realm of planning or thinking is a cognitive stressor. And then lastly, prosocial stressors are really what is like to feel for someone else. So otherwise, empathy. But I want to give an example of why these stressors are so connected and build on each other for any kind of patient. So just bear with me. So let's take planning a doctor's appointment as this example. So whether you're the one on the phone or your caregiver is taking on that task, you have to prepare yourself for a doctor's appointment. So that cognitive stress might be more heavy for those who are working or are managing a family, but it's really just any of this planning and preparing nonetheless that is in the cognitive domain in this example. And then you might think about how you're afraid about what you might learn from this appointment. So emotions come up in the emotional domain, like fear or worry. Then you might begin to feel what your loved one might be feeling about your worsening health or about making accommodations in their schedule, and how you feel if the roles were reversed, that how you would interpret things. And so that's that prosocial domain. And then with all of this going on, all of this inundated feelings from all these different places, you get a headache or you get a stomach ache, and that's, your physical domain. So in what I'm really trying to say here is that, first of all, I love having these different kinds or categories, domains of stress, because they help to peel things apart, but they also help to put things together. Because in moments like these, where again, the doctor's appointment, somebody trips and falls, anything that is a lot of confusing feelings at once, we tend to like I said, feel confused, or we even might speak or act in ways that are less than ideal. And we often can't express what we're going through because we're typically not analyzing and breaking apart our experiences in this way, like as they're happening. Um, but when we begin to get familiar with our stress by using these domains to break things down, which can happen after the fact, we can reflect back on that situation and be like, well, I was feeling this, emotionally. I was, really feeling worrisome or anxious, and I didn't want to go see that person. And I had already spent the day trying to get from here to here. Breaking things apart and even after the fact is so helpful. And the more that we can start to identify the stressors then we can start to do so bit by bit as they arise, so that we can begin to figure out ways to reduce them and ultimately express ourselves to others, which is a helpful tool in times of great stress. So some of you might have heard the phrase before, name it to tame it. There's been research that shows that just by naming the feeling or what's going on to ourselves, maybe to begin with, but then maybe eventually perhaps to others, naming what we're feeling, that there is an immediate stress reducing impact just by doing that. So again, we're going to talk more about our unique stress profiles next week, which feelings come up for us, what we are challenged with the most by perhaps, and then like a little bit, on communicating in various ways in week 3. But it can help to just begin to, I believe, label those feelings, even just starting out with ourselves. So guilt, frustration, anger, and so on. If there's any questions, again, as we're going along, please be sure to use the Q&A, or if you feel like sharing what you something that came up for you. But I want to talk about the stress of illness and disability. So it's easy to understand how those of us living with an illness or disability experience frequent stress. I talk about this all the time, but physical triggers like our pain or our side effects or loss of our ability or limitations to our bodies, on top of the fear and the sadness and anxiety, the appointments, the bills, all of those fuse together to make things pretty difficult. So this is me validating everything that you are feeling. You're not alone and you are understood here. So I just want to really make sure that that is clear. Along with the everyday demands of having an illness, I want to touch on one stress response that comes up so much for patients, and that is a growing disinterest, basically, in managing our own care, or alternatively, but similar, an unwillingness to relinquish our care and put that in another person's hands. So mounting guilt and shame, embarrassment perhaps, and then loss. We're going to talk about that in the form of grief, later on, these are all really, really common. Some common things I hear and have experienced myself are not scheduling or attending medical appointments, forgetting to take medications, or just like, you look at them and you just don't do it. Seeing medical treatments as pointless, not being honest with caregivers or doctors, or pushing away help or isolating ourselves. So it's really, really common, and it's really just a stress response. It's a lot of those domains we just talked about, mostly in the emotional domain, um, mounting and becoming hard to manage. So it's obvious by now that we're getting into the emotions of what it's like to have an illness like ALS. I don't know the physical demands, of course, of your condition, and I know that is what your local ALS chapter is so great at helping with, educate on and advocate for and provide. But we're going to deconstruct all the other kinds of stress. So not the physical demands that are particular to ALS, but a lot of these other kinds of stressors, starting with the emotional ones. And there are a lot of emotions that we encounter as patients living with incurable or degenerative diseases. Again, next week, we're going to work together on identifying those unique behaviors and signs. But for now, just know that this is certainly complex, and what comes out in our day-to-day experience, or what we see on the surface, right above this iceberg, is often covering up a lot more stuff. So I like to think of it kind of like using sandpaper. I've got two analogies, I guess, on this slide, iceberg and sandpaper, but I like to think of it kind of like using sandpaper. We have to agitate the top layer a bit to get to what's underneath it. And it'll eventually smooth things out. It's not the most pleasant to agitate or to uncover at the time, but what's below the surface to get to is worth it. And one of my favorite sayings is, what we resist persists. So if we resist going there, it's those feelings are only going to keep happening. So it's important for us to look underneath. And like I said, a lot of what's below the surface, a lot of that is below this metaphorical surface of the iceberg. We might think on the surface, well, I scream when I'm stressed out, or I get a headache, or I lose my appetite, or I get tired when I'm stressed. But let's consider the why behind those kinds of responses. And again, some of you might be really familiar with these, but I think it's important to just kind of chip away at. So, and I'm going to use the domains here to kind of bring us back. So emotional triggers might be things like guilt or fear or sadness. We've discussed these playing a major role. Cognitive tasks, of course, like planning appointments or learning a new piece of assistive technology, that can like be the thing that sets us off, and we don't recognize it above the surface. Social changes, like how to tell people about your diagnosis, or seeing people you haven't seen in a while and you might look or appear different, or realizing that some people aren't great friends after all. That's something that comes up in our community all the time. People who you thought would be there for you can't really handle it, or drift away. But even past trauma from early years in our life can lie dormant and have a major impact or dictate our thoughts and words and our actions. So especially if we were raised, for instance, in certain environments that portrayed chronically ill or disabled people as being weak, or as being not capable or unlovable, these all add up under the surface, and they can really I guess, okay, third metaphor would be a volcano. They will erupt later on. um, so this term that I like to use at this point is really reframing. So those above the surface things, let's talk about those. When we get frustrated with our situation, or snap at our loved one, those things that happen on the surface. Again, we might not have gotten to the reflecting part, what's below yet. It could be that we've snapped or reacted towards our caregiver, or it could be a total stranger. But we tend to see these as bad behaviors, and therefore we view ourselves as bad. I don't think I need to, it's no surprise that we all talk to ourselves worse than we would talk to a friend, right? Where we beat ourselves up. We have a lot of negative self-talk going on there. But we see that stuff that we do, those things that we exhibit on the surface as bad. And we beat ourselves up for them. We're not really nice to ourselves, which ultimately, of course, doesn't do anything for our relationship with that person. And of course, our relationship with ourselves. So, what I mean here by reframing our stress is that we begin to see ourselves with greater understanding and compassion. When we start to understand that many of these quote unquote bad behaviors are just a result of being stressed, we can ease up on ourselves, first of all. And it often comes with then changing the way that we speak to ourselves, catching ourselves in those critical self-critical, moments, and then reframing them. So we first notice that self-talk. For instance, a personal one I used to say to myself was, I'm such a burden or such a grumpy person. Why would anyone love me? Recognition of having that thought in the first place is step one. Then we can eventually over time start to say, well, I'm not such a burden. My body didn't ask for this either. I have this illness, it's real. Look at this. There's someone here who wants to help me, or I'm so lucky that I have a community, or finding the things in your life that you can reframe. But really it starts with ourselves and the way that we begin to speak to ourselves. And then we can move on to, of course, reframing to find gratitude and such, which we'll talk more about in week 3. But we start to notice eventually, I find the same for our loved ones who can show up to situations in a reactive or a not so ideal way too. So we begin to see that they're also coping with many difficult emotions, right? And then when we reframe our own stress, we start to be able to reframe theirs. So plenty of research has shown that compassion for ourselves kind of spills over and leads into compassion for another, which is really a nice bonus of starting to reframe the way that we talk to ourselves. And it really, I just, as a reinforcement recap here, it really starts with catching those adverse behaviors that are above the surface, and then noticing that they're not just you're a bad person, you're just a stressed person living with a rare disease. So this is a really simple diagram, but it illustrates what I was just getting into, is that our stress levels are directly connected to the people closest to us. I'm going to preface this by saying that in no way this should make you feel any greater sense of guilt. If that is an emotion that comes up for you when looking at this connection here, then I'm so glad that you're here, because this is simply just the reality of the patient-caregiver relationship. It's a two-way street. A major part of reframing our stress is acknowledging the role that stress has on our caregiver. And the same goes for them. So they too must acknowledge that their stress level impacts us as the patient. Knowing this truth is very helpful so that we can start to find strategies that work for us at times of great stress. So maybe it's a personal affirmation that works for you of kindness or compassion towards yourself. Maybe it's finding a way to get some fresh air. Maybe it's listening to music or an audiobook, or I don't know, videos of cats on the internet. However you find some peace, we've got to prioritize that. We will talk more about this in the following weeks, but I just want you in those moments to remember the stress cycle every time and think about tending to yourself as taking care of your relationship you have with your caregivers, right? And your loved ones, because they help us get the best quality of life, and hopefully they are a source of calming support at difficult times when we need it most. not selfish at all, totally an essential part of being a patient. So one source of stress that is extremely common for patients is empathizing with our caregivers and loved ones. And I referred to this earlier on as the prosocial domain. So this is prosocial stress. It's important to acknowledge that they're dealing with fears and frustrations as well. And even if they are not the one with the illness. So a lot of times we're like, well, you're not the one who's sick. And that's true. Completely true. But they've got other kinds of stress too. So our loved ones and our caregivers are experiencing potentially chronic stress, right? Due to possible burnout, and they've got a lot of things they're juggling. And again, this might be hard to acknowledge as a patient. I feel you as a patient myself, but it's necessary if we want to have a healthy relationship. But they too can get caught in the stress cycle, and we may notice that they become withdrawn or irritable at times. We might notice that they avoid or deny the source of their stress, which could be our illness. They may lose patience with us and showcase their own reactive behaviors. Nobody's perfect. Or they might turn to substances like alcohol or food to dull their feelings, or ultimately they might become ill from not managing their own chronic stress. When this happens, our source of calm becomes a source of stress. And I'd be remiss to not include a note here that if this does happen, to please reach out to your local ALS chapter for support and for resources. But as patients, we might also experience kind of in this realm feelings like we're being pitied. So there is a major difference, of course, between empathy and sympathy, and that's what this slide really ultimately highlights. So while sympathy is feeling sorry for someone else, empathy is the act of trying to understand someone else's circumstance or emotions. I would even add on to this, if I had all the time, a whole section about compassion and about how compassion is really a building on of empathy, where we first of all can put ourselves in the shoes of the other person and then offer a sense of kindness and love to them. Excuse me. So while others cannot possibly know what it's like to have ALS, empathy at least means that they're trying to put themselves in your position. Often this is the most that someone can do. And you might have experienced the same as a patient, right? Imagining how your loved ones feel can be so uncomfortable. And we often push those feelings away. But running away does leave you and your care partners disconnected. So we want to have as much engagement there and acknowledgement as possible. And again, it often requires going below the surface of that iceberg. And we're almost at the end here. So in doing this work, I know that some diseases such as ALS have a sudden onset and they progress quickly. It changes life and your visions for it very rapidly. And receiving a diagnosis in a family setting changes plans and the life you had imagined. And, not just for you, but those closest to you. We grieve this loss just like we grieve the loss of anything or anyone. And grieving is often accompanied by 5 steps, which I'm sure many of you have heard before. It might sound strange to grieve something that isn't necessarily dead, but when we think of our imagined life or our dreams as alive, it certainly becomes more understandable. So just going through these and why they really are essential to work through. Denial can set in at the time of your diagnosis. Perhaps, I'm going to go out on a limb and guess that everybody here is past this stage because you signed up for this workshop. But perhaps you initially responded to the diagnosis by wondering if it was a misdiagnosis or searching for other opinions or doom scrolling on the internet. I know I did. for many years. Anger might be at your genes or at no one in particular, but just at the cards you've been dealt. Maybe it's at the universe or a higher power if that's a part of your life. Bargaining might not actually occur at all, but it does for some people, and it can manifest in, seeking control. So sometimes people make deals. If I do this over here, then this will happen. Making a promise, again to if a higher power is a part of your life, that's very normal. Depression seems obvious, but this is the point where seeing a mental health professional often really helps. And lastly, I'm not telling anyone to accept their circumstances right now. I would never tell a caregiver or a patient to just accept their diagnosis or their loved one's diagnosis, but that's what we're ultimately working on, and it is the fifth stage of grieving. And the way that I see acceptance, because I've been asked this question many times before: do you accept your do you accept your condition? I think it's a journey. I think that, there's peaks and valleys of acceptance. Some days we do, and some days we hate it so much. But that, this word acceptance doesn't mean a place of joy or happiness. It can just mean that you know that there are good days and there's bad days, but there's good ones to come. And there's still bad things that happen and bad times, and that life is messy and it's unpredictable. And accepting that life is messy and unpredictable in and of itself is a major step in the right direction. So we have about 6 minutes for questions and answers, of course. I'm going to respond to the ones in the Q&A box first. Feel free to enter more. And if a question comes up for you after this, you can always ask them next week, or you can email us through the website or just by emailing info@beyondmybattle.org. So I'm going to go to the Q&A box now. We have a question that says, I have been in the anger stage for a couple of years now, and I don't know how to stop the anger when my old ways of dealing with stress were to go for a run or workout. How do I get past this? That is an awesome question, because I totally relate to that, with finding limitations in my own body that I can no longer use as a stress reliever. I think it's always going to be personal, right? So it's going to be you finding things that help you release anger that work for you. It could be screaming. It could be screaming in your mind. It could be if you can use a pencil to draw. A lot of people, that's like, I don't want to encourage people to not address anger. I think that anger is essential. A lot of times you hear people telling others to just be positive, or just, you're not angry, just focus on the good stuff. I don't fully think that that's correct, because anger is part of this process, and we've got to get it out. So that being said, though, I do find that certain types of meditation help for not getting anger out, but shifting the angry emotions. There's a specific kind of meditation that is really well known and been studied for a long time, called loving kindness. One word, loving kindness. And it's a really incredible, really incredible way to transfer the feelings that are not so great into feelings of compassion for yourself, for other people. I highly recommend checking it out. There's tons of free loving kindness meditations out there. The teacher that I would recommend the most, her name is Sharon Salzberg. Those are just my personal preferences. I think that depending on the body, where your body is at, there's of course other things that are available, but I want to keep it pretty broad here. Someone just chimed in on this question saying how to stop the anger before it gets full blown. So that is where the reflecting on those domains is going to start. You're going to start to see it. The more that we can, even in like Monday, everyday experiences, tiny bits of agitation, stomach ache, anything, really stopping and to reflect back on, okay, how did I get here? How did I get to feel agitated this way? What's going on socially, emotionally, cognitively, prosocially, biologically might be an obvious one in this situation. The more that we pull apart what goes on in the day-to-day, not so explosive situations, when those full-blown angry outbursts they start to arise, I'm telling you, you might not have them entirely, but they will start to reduce in size. Over time, they will they will just kind of deflate. And it really just takes, I feel, reflecting on, and we'll get into this next week, getting familiar with how stress presents itself in your individual body and in your individual mindset. Could be the way that you speak, could be body language, it could be fight, could be flight, leaving the room. We're going to talk about that a lot next week. So I love that question because I think it's reflecting on those domains and then getting super familiar with how they present themselves in your life, so that when those situations come up, they can be more mindfully addressed and maybe just tapered back a little. I still have full-blown anger moments, and I've been practicing this work and meditate every day. We're all human. So one or two other questions here. I'm at a point where I'm sick of doctor's appointments just to hear the same things every time. And I know that my body is getting worse. I know that you can't recommend going or not going, but how should I best handle this feeling? Yeah, I certainly can't recommend not going. I would definitely recommend going. But I can empathize with you. I completely understand. I have to go see the doctor for my condition on a pretty regular basis, and it seems like every time it's the same answer. And um, uh, so so it's frustrating, and I just want to validate that, especially when the body is getting worse and worse. That must be incredibly disheartening and feeling like just awful. I would say for me, it would be about handling this feeling would come in the form of, if there's people in my life who I know it would make them feel better for me to go. I tend to, try to be of service to other people. And I guess feeling like I'm being of service to my parents every time that I go, being of service to them every time that I take my medication. That helps me. And I've heard that that helps other people. I think that um, again, it's a personal experience. So it could be writing, journaling, writing, whether it's with an assisted technology or by hand writing somehow. I have a friend who has ALS and he blogs, and that's how he gets his emotions out, using the eye gaze technology, and that's how he copes. So I think it's going to be a personal thing to figure out how to manage those feelings, but those are my 2 cents on that.